coming up on Chopper's Political Podcast.
Yeah, you're very welcome to declare you're standing on this podcast for DG. It's fine.
I mean, myself?
Yes, it's fine. We can take that.
Yeah. I'm going to rule it out. I mean, I don't want to give you just a cheap headline, but I'm going to rule it out.
Okay. Welcome back to Chopper's Political Podcast, where I bring you the best guest gossip, news and stories from a GB News studios at the heart of Westminster. My name is Christopher Hope, and I'm our political editor here. Well, it feels like we've been saying this for a lot in recent years, but what a week it's been in politics, as two great British institutions find themselves in absolute chaos. Later, we'll be talking about what on earth is going on at the BBC. I'll be joined by the former Culture Secretary, Sir John Whittingdale, and the veteran TV producer, Rob Burley, who worked at the BBC amongst many different shows, including, of course, the Andrew Marr show on Sunday mornings. But first, what is going on at the top of our government? As coordinated briefs emerged this week saying that the PM will fight any attempt to replace him, and others pointing a direct finger at the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. The following day, the PM made clear he hadn't authorised any attacks on ministers. So what really is happening here? Is there a lack of discipline in number 10? Are Labour MPs actually planning a coup against a Labour leader who won a landslide majority at the election last year? I remind you, of course, that there are only two Labour figures who have won majorities at elections who are still living, Tony Blair and Sir Keir Starmer. It all sounds bonkers to me. What about you? But joining me now, let's see, to make some sense of it, from Labour MP Graham Stringer. Graham, welcome to Chopper's Political Podcast. I'm going to call you a Labour grandee because you've been an MP since 1997. You've been around the houses a bit. You've seen Labour, the first term, the Blairite, Brownite government, and then, of course, the Starmer government now. Why have we got to this point where people are discussing a leadership challenge against a Labour Prime Minister who won a majority, a big super majority in last year's general election?
Well, I think I and other people who've been around for some time are constantly comparing, in our minds at least, the current situation with the Blair-Brown time. I think one of the issues is the new Labour MPs in particular find it very difficult to get meetings with ministers. And that's very different from the 97 to 2010 period. There were things that went wrong with that government. But one of the things you couldn't criticise about was that not being available. Even the Prime Minister, it sometimes took 2 or 3 weeks, but if you wanted to see Tony Blair, you could see Tony Blair, usually for 15 minutes after PMQs, behind the Speaker's chair in his office there. So with new MPs, that makes them particularly anxious because they want to go back to their constituency and say, I told the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I told the Prime Minister this. On top of those personal relationships, the budgets at the start of this administration went down like a lead balloon. Unemployment's gone up since then. There were all sorts of potential breaches of manifesto commitments, and that made MPs unhappy. They were surprised. They found it difficult to be supportive. So we've created very quickly an unhappy ship, which is being made worse by the speculation around the budgets of breaking serious manifesto commitments.
On income tax or whatever, national insurance, VAT, one of those will be going up, probably income tax, everyone thinks, and maybe coming down in national insurance. But either way, that will be a breach. That's right.
And most Labour MPs think that's wrong.
Yeah.
You know, it will damage the Labour Party, but it also damages democracy itself. There's enough scepticism about politicians and breaking their promises without doing it so blatantly and publicly.
Do you think that I was on the issue of the budget in less than 2 weeks now? Do you think if that manifesto pledge is broken, if one of those three taxes go up, Labour will lose the chance to win a second term? Is it that scale of worry for you?
I think it's very damaging. I mean, what do you say as a candidate in the next general election? You go out and say, we will do X, Y, and Z. And they say, well, you said you were going to do X, Y, and Z last time, and nobody will believe us or trust us. It may well be that putting up income tax now is the right response to the situation we're in, but you still have to keep the promises made at the last general election. It's not a war that started. The economy is going roughly how people expected it. There's no major change that's happened. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult to find the next general election if we break such fundamental parts of the manifesto.
And so from that, it goes to where this plotting is happening. I mean, are there plots against Keir Starmer right now in the Labour backbenches and also at cabinet level?
It's great unhappiness. I think the feeling is that there is no sense of direction and there is no clear policy direction. The discussions around the budget are not helpful. Chancellors used to refuse to discuss things before the budget in a period called purdah, as you will know.
Oh, yeah.
But saying we will get rid of the two-child limit, we will not get rid of the two-child limit is just unsettling. And then on top of that, because the political officials who work in number 10 Downing Street are worried that the budget is going to go through, but they're worried that there will be a lot of comment and dissent around the budget. They have started attacking cabinet ministers.
Yeah.
And I think the operation in number 10 is, as Wes Streeting has said, is toxic and chaotic. And I think there's a feeling that Keir should come back more often into number 10 and take control. Not that there should be a replacement. Yeah. There is no obvious replacement.
No. How many MPs do you think currently want Keir Starmer out? I saw reports of maybe 50 Labour MPs would support a rival candidate. Is that what you recognise?
I would have no idea about numbers. I would put it as wishful thinking on behalf of some people that they would like somebody who would be doing a better job. Actually, they would like Keir to be doing a better job. I think that's the real issue. They would want him to get down, take control of the operation, say very clearly what we were doing, why we were doing it, when it was going to happen. Because that isn't happening at the moment. There is talk about a replacement, but that talk stops dead because nobody can decide on a candidate. So the idea that there's 50 people who would be willing to sign up for a candidate is not something I really recognise. Unhappiness, yes, but not direct organisation.
But the attempt to spike the guns of the plotters on Tuesday night into Wednesday meant that we all started watching Wes Streeting's speech to NHS providers on Wednesday afternoon as though this was a pitch for the leader's job. I mean, we now look at him and think, is he going to be a better leader? He's almost been transformed in how we look at him as a possible successor, when before that, I mean, outside of the Westminster bubble, no one thought that way.
Well, absolutely. The headline in the Daily Mail today would not have happened without this ill-thought-out attack from people from number 10. They're saying that there's going to be a general election, Keir will not be there. It's extraordinary. It's fiction. It is constitutionally highly unlikely to happen, but it creates more instability. I mean, electorate who don't follow these things in the detail that you and I do are beginning to wonder what's going on. So I think the first thing he has to do is get a grip of that number 10 organisation.
I mean, Mrs. Hope woke up on Wednesday morning saying, is Keir Starmer leaving office? I said, no. But there was that kind of surprise over the breakfast table on Wednesday morning, I think, and really caused by, it seems, number 10 trying to deal with an issue which really didn't need to be dealt with in this way. Where do you go from here? I mean, what would your advice be to Sir Keir Starmer? I thought in PMQs, his best bit in a difficult PMQs was a question from a Plaid Cymru MP who said, will he come to Real Beach and support Real Beach? And he said, words the effect of a walk along Real Beach is quite an attractive idea at the moment, and everyone laughed. And that's really the Keir Starmer who I've met privately. He has got quite a good sense of humour. He's quite self-effacing. He's quite funny, and he's got to somehow connect better. And maybe humour's the way to do it. I don't know.
I think that's absolutely right. He comes over as a very cold fish, really, and he isn't that. He's a decent sort of person. He's got a sense of humour, but I think he'd be able to show that more if he was on top of a programme. I mean, what is it? What I come back to the point. What is the chance of the Exchequer before a budget's doing, and the Prime Minister themselves saying different things about parts of the budget? It creates an uncertainty. And going back to the point about a general election that's not going to happen, Brenda in Bristol will be wondering not another general election again. So it's all very damaging.
It is. I see a lot of Rishi Sunak in Keir Starmer. I was followed him very closely at GB News over the 2 years. He was nearly 2 years when he was in post. I mean, they both appear to be very decent men trying to do their best, but they appear to be fenced in by the politics. They can't quite see why they're doing it, and the walls are closing in on them. Do you see what I mean? And they're both.
I do see precisely. And again, going back to the comparison between Tony Blair and Keir, if Tony walked into a room, he had a presence, and the people he was talking to believed that he understood their situation and was going to do something about it.
Yeah.
I once, before he was Prime Minister, drove Tony Blair around Manchester. It's the most extraordinary experience. We went to see some hard-bitten residents of Moss Side after there'd been shootings, and he charmed them. They were convinced he understood what the situation was. He then talked to students. They were the same. The government then was trying to change get rid of chief superintendents and superintendents. We went to talk to them, most cynical people in the world, and he charmed them. They ran out of.
I know. But he's not. He's no Tony Blair. I mean, I look at their background. I see Tony Blair when he was a barrister as a jury barrister, convincing 12 people of a case. I look at Keir Starmer, and he's a judge's barrister, convincing maybe 3 judges of a dusty argument. And that almost goes to the heart of what you're describing there, the difference between the two men. And needs to channel some of that adversarial idea you're pushing there from Tony Blair to convince people of an argument, meet them where they are, and convince them of why this Labour PM is the answer.
That's right. I mean, Harold Wilson, I'm going back a long time now.
They're fine.
But it's an important point, I think, that Harold Wilson started off when he was leader of the Labour Party, as though he was giving a lecture in Oxford as an academic, as a don.
Yeah.
And somebody said to him, you need to lighten up a bit. And he did the most extraordinary thing. He learned to have a sense of humour.
Yes,
and he was very... And Keir needs to learn to empathise and to be able to protect what I'm sure are genuine feelings about the situation. He's not such a cold fish. No. He needs to learn how to express that.
He became quite twinkly, Wilson. And if I think, as I remember, that the pipe was actually a prop. And he liked
He
cigars.
likes, that's right.
He found
That's right.
something that he liked. I mean,
Yeah.
just looking forward from here, what are the odds, do you think, on Keir Starmer fighting the next election as your leader?
Well, I think there'll probably be a crisis around the budgets. I've always expected a crisis around the local elections, the Scottish and Welsh elections next May, because that is hard and difficult news. More important than polls for MPs and for councillors, because they say real votes in real ballot boxes, not going Labour's way.
And by that you mean Wales and Wales could be lost maybe to reform. Scotland could be lost if reform keep Labour out and the SNP falls. So, and also, of course, there's thousands of council seats in England up for grabs. So it's a real referendum on his premiership.
That's right. And for MPs, many of the new MPs have got majorities of less than 4,000. It's going to be very difficult for them to see their local councils losing their seats if they do, with significant votes against, and they will add it up and think, I'm not going to stay here. So there will be a crisis point of what do we do now, and it will give some reality to, is there a candidate who would be a better Prime Minister than Keir? So to answer your question directly, will he be the candidate at the next general election? I think it depends how he deals on what seems like an inevitable crisis. If he can't deal with that, if he can't convince the Labour Party nationally and in Parliament that he can at least give us a chance in the next general election, then he may well not fight that election.
So as things stand, is maybe 50-50 for him standing?
I'm not a bookie. It just depends how those elections go, how bad they are. I'm convinced they will be bad. But it could be bad or very bad or terminal.
I look at the team around him, and you look at these prime ministers going back through Tony Blair. I mean, he had the team around him, didn't he? Andrew Hunter, obviously for a bit, Alistair Campbell, and he had a team around him. Gordon Brown had worked well with him for most of the time he was there. And then you look at David Cameron. He had a team of Praetorian Guard around him who had him protected from Andrew Feldman in central office to Ed Llewellyn as chief of staff to Gary Burton as a press person, and so it went on. And you need to have a team who around the principal PM who know how to get the best out of him. And I just think Keir Starmer has lost that since he became the Prime Minister. I mean, he's losing a lot of key people who know what makes him tick, and that's a worry, I think.
I think that is a worry. As I said before, I don't really know the people in Number 10. I observe from a distance. But Morgan McSweeney seems to let his own ego get in the way of helping Keir. I mean, he seems to...
We don't know he's behind the briefings. We don't know that.
I wasn't going to say that. We don't know that. But what I was going to say was that he does claim, both by briefing and directly, that he was responsible for the last general election victory. And he shouldn't be doing that. One, it was a victory, but actually the Labour vote wasn't very good. It was the Conservatives that lost it more, but he's wrong. I mean, he should be saying Keir did this, not I did it. So I think Keir has to sort out that relationship as the key part of his relationship with those advisors in Number 10. The other thing he needs to do, and maybe he started to do it, is have really close relationships with 4 or 5 members of the cabinet who he can rely on, in the way that David Cameron and George Osborne were a double act. You know, they talked to each other, they trusted each other. I don't see that relationship between Keir and anybody else within the cabinet. And at the end of the day, when people start throwing rocks at you, you need the shelter of both those officials and of close cabinet colleagues.
Yeah. Well, Graham Stringer, thanks for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast. Great to dig deep into your institutional memory of the last Labour government and see lessons for that. Great to see you, and thanks for coming on. All the best.
Hello, I'm Bev Turner. Now, it can feel like the money in our bank accounts at the moment does not keep up with the cost of living, and maybe there's a solution. I'm here today with the CEO of TallyMoney, Cameron Parry. Cameron, what is TallyMoney?
Well, Bev, with TallyMoney, you get a current account and a debit card, but instead of pounds, you use milligrams of gold as your everyday money.
So why gold?
Gold traditionally is a great store of value. It has, on average, gone up at over 11% per annum for the last 25 years against the pound. It's tripled in value in the last decade. And in the last 2 years alone, it's increased by 50% against the pound. Banks' savings products just can't compete with that level of growth.
But this isn't just about gold. This is about a currency that you guys have created at TallyMoney. Explain it to me as though I'm an idiot.
So, look, people need to be able to hold their earnings and build their savings in a money that retains its value and remains in their legal control and remains theirs to access, away from government control.
Great. You had me at not exposed to government control.
You should feel safe and happy with your money. You should have peace of mind the more money you see in your bank balance, and that's the type of thing we're trying to deliver and give people choice in the type of money they get to use every day.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cameron. Thank you.
Graham Stringer, thank you for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast. Food for thought there. Now, next up, from one institution in crisis, the Labour Party, the Labour government, to another one, the BBC. This week, the Director General and the CEO of BBC News both resigned from their posts after a misleading edit of a Panorama documentary about Donald Trump in the lead-up to polling day in 2024 in that American presidential election. What is going on at the BBC? I'm joined by someone who really knows. Rob Burley. He's a fantastic journalist. I've known him for many years. He edited the Andrew Marr Show on Sunday mornings on the BBC, the Andrew Neil Show, and the Politics Live Show, amongst many others. And Rob Burley is also the author of a book, Why Is This Lying Bastard Lying to Me? And upon that book, which featured analysis and stories about famous TV political interviews, became a TV show called Brian and Margaret, looking at how when Brian Walden, the veteran ITV interviewer, interviewed Margaret Thatcher when she was Prime Minister. Rob Burley, thank you for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast. What an extraordinary week it's been for the BBC. Another crisis, of course. They seem to come along quite frequently, almost to justify the BBC's existence. At the heart of this is a claim that the BBC is biased in favour of the left against the right. In your 13 years there, of course, you were experienced. You ran the political unit in Westminster. You edited the Andrew Marr Show. You're the deputy editor of Newsnight. Did you experience any of this bias that's been talked about?
Well, I think when I thought about this when I was writing a book about my career, I had to be honest about that and say I do believe that the sort of cultural kind of gravity of the BBC is slightly to the left. I would say that's true. Yes. Now but wait, that I think is because the kind of people who are attracted to the BBC tend to be slightly, or have traditionally tended to be slightly to the left or the centre left. But importantly, there are all the people I work with there. They were very much. They were proud to sort of leave that at the door. That's the whole point. The purpose of your role there as a journalist is try and be impartial. It's not always easy. It's worth trying. It's definitely worth leaving those ideas at the door, because the journalism you can do if you are impartial, I believe, is the most important kind. And so I would say it was slightly to the left, but I'm not saying therefore that the people there delivered a left-wing product all the time, at least.
When I used to work for the Telegraph, people would come along and say to me they had proof of the BBC's bias, and one of the ways they tried to prove it was it never quite worked out, but often in questioning on sort of TV, on shows, maybe the Today programme or other shows, that the questioner would say, well, what can the government do about this? And for those on the right, they would say, well, maybe the government should do nothing. So why, if the government is always the answer, that becomes a degree of bias. I mean, I know it never quite stacked up, and it's quite hard proving bias, really, frankly. But that was one of the ways in previous times.
Yeah, well, I don't think that's a bad observation, actually, because I do think there's what you interrogate is how do we come at the story. So if, for example, if somebody or an organization is saying some people need some help and some money, then is our default always that means that therefore there should be some money provided by the taxpayer? Whereas there could be a conversation about whether that's an appropriate way in which to approach provision for things. That would strike me as that's a really interesting thing to do, and therefore it should be done as part of the package of coverage. You shouldn't always come at it from that perspective of the government should step in. And actually, on the programs I did, like Politics Live and certainly on Newsnight, I think we did do things like that. We did try and disrupt it. But here's a really important thing I have to point out, which is that often happens because you've got experienced editors and producers in the room. Yeah. And what the BBC did in 2021 was just hollow out the organisation. So the sort of institutional memory of the BBC, kind of a lot of it has left the building. And so therefore you don't have someone who goes, hang on a minute, guys. It's not always the case that people think X or Y. Sometimes they might think A or B. Do you want to think about that? And that only happens if you have people with experience who want to point it out.
And then you have maybe a view on Donald Trump, which all your friends share, your work colleagues share, about this guy is pretty, they might think he's a dreadful guy. He's got appalling views on women. It's been recorded. And therefore, does it matter if they simply bring in a clip from the first few minutes of speech against the ones in 53 minutes and then not do a flash, not to indicate there's been an edit there? I mean, so that is how bias can damage a brand, isn't it? Because no one challenges, are you being fair to the subject here?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that Michael Prescott mentioned was why was there no equivalent program about Kamala Harris? Now, and it's a good point, because actually, one thing I thought was really interesting in the run-up to the election was, if you sat there and thought, what would a Kamala Harris foreign policy look like? Would it be effective? Would it be change? Well, actually, I think you could put together quite an interesting argument there that said it would have been pretty much business as usual from Biden. Was that working? I mean, that's arguably not. So there's all sorts of interesting questions if you approach it journalistically in a way that's open to things. But I mean, look, the other thing is, it seems to me that on January the 6th, it was pretty clear that Donald Trump was with one way or another, with a nod and a wink, saying, go and cause some trouble. And when the trouble happened, he didn't really do anything to stop it for ages. So you don't need to confect something to create that impression in the way that this edit did. You can demonstrate by the totality of what happened and what was said at different times that you don't always have to say explicitly do this. There's a tacit idea that is promoted by him. I think that's a perfectly reasonable argument. But why go further? It strikes me as a kind of a troubling instinct. And
there was a clip of those, they call them the Proud Boys, marching to the Capitol, when in fact that happened before Trump spoke. I mean, those things are a problem on that program. Yeah. And it's intriguing, isn't it, that these warnings were given to the board of the BBC or the committee below the board of the BBC in January and May this year, and yet nothing appeared to happen. I mean, as we understand it so far, speaking this week on Thursday.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Prescott memo is a memo about things not happening. People have told things about things that have gone wrong, and nothing happens. And extraordinarily. Jonathan Munro, who actually still there at the BBC, he didn't resign, and who's even I've seen being kind of tipped to be the next Director General or Head of News, one of the two, probably Head of News, is one of those who actually said, having seen this material, said it was fine. I mean, that's kind of, I don't understand how he could possibly. I mean, I work with him. I've no axe to grind, but I don't understand why he could have thought that, and why he could even be in the frame for being Head of News if that's what he said.
Yes, I think he's now replaced Deborah Turness temporarily and maybe full-time in that role as CEO of BBC News. Tim Davie is the Director General. In your book, Why Is This Lying Bastard Lying to Me? You're not saying that Tim Davie is a lying bastard, but you do talk about, well, you're not saying that, but you did talk about a meeting you had with Tim Davie in the book when there was a choice made by the team running the corporation to scale back the rather popular Andrew Neil interview show.
Yeah, it's really a sad thing that, a show that, for example, had an interview with Keir Starmer all about his pledges that he made to the Labour membership back in 2020, 2020, right?
When he became leader, exactly.
Yeah, when he was running for leader. It was really important because what it was Andrew just saying, okay, let's establish that this is what you're promising. This is what you're promising. This is what you're promising. And that became important sort of reference point for journalists later about what he promised. And actually, it's the theme of the book is the loss of the long form interview, the opportunity to really put politicians under pressure. And what happened was we had this show that did that, and the first opportunity, Tim Davie, well, at least the people when he was the director general, it was axed, and nothing else was offered to Andrew Neil. Now, this is really weird to me. I mean, it's so strange. I mean, the reason I think was that the program went out in the evening, and they thought we might rate better with a show about, I don't know, cookery or something, which is fine if you're worried about ratings that are here today, gone tomorrow. But the really important thing at that time was to demonstrate impartiality, and what better way of demonstrating impartiality to the BBC than saying this is a place where Andrew Neil, who's a man coming from the right, coming with a very experience in business, all those things, can do a show and have a major role. Instead, they were happy to sort of let that fall away, and he left. And so, and I suggested to Tim Davie he really had to pull out all the stops to keep Andrew Neil. Yeah, he didn't give me any undertaking he would, and then he didn't, and he left.
I never thought Andrew Neil was overtly right wing. Actually, when he was doing, I thought he just basically was a bit of a brutal interviewer, frankly. In the
don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting he was pursuing a right wing sort of agenda when he interviewed people so much as his instinct, as you just mentioned earlier. He wouldn't come at a story from necessarily the orthodox kind of BBC-ish point of view. He would come at it from a very different place. Oh, but he would enjoy the sport with whoever it was the prey.
I guess long form has moved into podcasting. I mean, this podcast has got a lot of long form interviews, but there's a need for that also on linear terrestrial TV, of course.
For sure, but I mean, I don't suppose it's so much of a grilling as it used to. You might term it. I mean, sometimes a grilling is what's required, and I think podcasts are great because they prove that people actually enjoy depth. But whether it's the right place to do sort of
that jousting, the jousting. Podcasts are not the same way at all. You have been a critic before about Tim Davie. You certainly were in May 2023. You said he had a failure to really understand journalism, and he did talk about this issue of scrutiny. Has he been found wanting here, or is it impossible to be the person in charge of Traitors and Strictly and also hard news?
Well, I mean, I think there could be a question about whether some of that should be sort of farmed out to deputies or whatever. I mean, it used to be a deputy. I seem to remember he left an enormous bonus, from my memory, or a great pension, something like that. But no, there were deputies. I mean, I don't know if that's the answer. I mean, the thing was that Tim Davie made much of impartiality. Yeah, there was an example that I knew about, which was, him not doing the right thing to deliver impartiality. So I took a bit of a dim view of that. He also, and again, I mentioned this in the meeting. He also, when I raised to him the dangers of this plan to essentially hollow out the BBC's journalistic experience,
yes.
It wasn't interested. The thing that can be frustrating in the BBC is that it's very hierarchical, and even if you get a meeting with somebody, really they don't take any notice of what you got to say. They're not really. I mean, maybe that's the way in many places, but there's just no interest in a dissenting voice. It's just, and in fact, I was out the door within a few months. So. It wasn't encouraging.
And that goes back to the heart of maybe that remark that struck me anyway from Tim Davies talking to Staff this week. He called the critics of the BBC enemies. I just think that isn't really, that's going after the man or the woman saying what is being said rather than the argument they're saying, isn't it?
I think, to be honest, I've just been kind of amazed by the way in which they've just decided to handle the kind of aftermath of the resignations, and I woke up this morning thinking, oh, was it all a bad dream? It's a BBC thing, was it? But they've ended up in a way without a director general or head of news, and they're being sued by the president of the United States. And this is quite a thing. So I sort of, that isn't the sort of thing. If you did that right, you might think then you'd move quite quickly into contrition mode, because you want to really emphasize how you really take it seriously. And in fact, they really do need to do that with Donald Trump. But instead we've seen this kind of denial of what's gone on. I'm not a BBC basher. I love the BBC. I think we should point out there are lots of people who are joining the argument who would like the BBC to end or be diminished. And I'm not one of those people. I really love the BBC, and I think there are people who go after it. But if something like this happens, and there's a litany of things in that document, you don't just act as if it's okay. No, it's not okay. And that's the worst thing you can do for the future of the BBC. And that's how it looks to me this morning. I mean, and all the attempt to just sort of move it on to blaming somebody else, in this case Robbie Gibb on the board, is just it just seems bizarre.
What's your take on Robbie Gibb? Of course, he was the comms director for Theresa May in Number 10, but you knew him, didn't you, closely working with him in the political unit in Westminster for the BBC. Is he obviously a Tory? Is that are these critics right to say that, Lib Dems notably?
Well, I mean, what people are in terms of when you chat with them over a pint or whatever, or talk about stuff, sometimes that can be quite obvious that he's on the right. I don't think that's the right question. As it were, the right question, because was he pursuing that in the agenda Yeah, was he doing that? I think the way that he saw it, I think he did see that the programs he was editing as sometimes something of a corrective to a general direction of travel of stuff. I mean, look, he's a very formidable person. There's much in I think in this sort of talk about him being in the board meeting and being a strong voice. I mean, he is a strong voice. He knows what he thinks. But if it's a secret coup, then why get the guy who's on the board to do it? He's already on the board. It's not hiding, is it? We know he's there. It's a bit silly, that, really, it seems to me. I mean, all it is he made an argument, I guess. Yeah. He probably put his hand up and said, this stuff that Michael's discovered is kind of serious. I mean, and I think he's right on that. But we didn't agree on everything. I mean, we just agreed on things about Brexit and how we should cover that in the aftermath of the referendum. And, so it wasn't like I would just sort of say that we agreed on everything at all. But I just don't think, I think it's weird and silly and a mistake to try and blame him for these errors that have been sort of allowed through by others.
And what happens next, do you think? I mean, how do you restore that trust? It seems to me they've got to widen the pool from which they hire talent, or not talent, but also maybe backroom staff to try and ensure perhaps people who don't go to Russell Group universities or don't live in London or whatever it might be, to try and bring in different people to the BBC. That could help, but that's a long-term change of culture.
But I mean, to be fair, the BBC have almost to a fault, like taken lots of places in the programs, taken them out of London. I don't think, but in fact, you probably don't even end up with that difficult sort of like demographic or whatever of people in the end. So I mean, whether that will do it or not, I don't know. But I mean, I think they should be open to. They should be, in terms of the job of the DG. I mean, that's the big thing. Is who are they going to, and head of news? Who are they going to get? Who will put their head above the parapet and decide to take that on? It's a very difficult one. But you're right. I mean, you're right. It would be good for the BBC to broaden. Generally speaking, I think it needs to welcome and be curious about ideas that aren't going to go down well in sort of North London. Just and try and bring diversity of opinion and voice into the place. You should want to do that anyway. I don't know why it's a problem. It shouldn't be a problem. It should be a good thing about it.
Yeah, you're very welcome to declare you're standing on this podcast for DG. It's fine. You can.
I mean, myself.
Yes, it's fine. We can take that. Yeah.
I'm going to rule it out. I mean, I don't want to give you just a cheap headline, but I'm going to rule it out.
Okay. We're talking on Thursday into Friday. Friday, of course, is a day when the BBC have got to decide by 10 p.m. UK time, 5 p.m. US time, what to do about this Donald Trump $1 billion legal action over the edited Panorama. What would you do if you were them?
Well, I think it's just so funny, isn't it? The $1 million. It's so funny. You couldn't make it up, really, because I think that in terms of they have to stop behaving the way they've behaved since it happened, right? So start being a bit contrite and serious about it. I think they can make a point. Well, this program wasn't shown in the US. This program really made very little impact, and it's a bit spurious to pretend it's had any impact on him. But just be contrite. Accept the gravity of it, be appropriate to the position you're in. As I said, you've lost your DG, you've lost your head of news, and you are being sued by the President of the United States. Let's see that in the way you come across.
Yeah, and heads of roles. The issue of money, though, I think that the real problem will be this weekend if the BBC does agree a settlement of some sort of money, and then that becomes a kind of Trump tax on our licence fees for the BBC's mistakes. That would be a disaster for them.
My God, I mean, Is that I haven't seen. Is that actually being mooted? Right, there could be.
Well, no, it's not. I'm really saying how it'll be interpreted. If the BBC did pay out a sum of money to Trump, the critics will divide that into the number of those paying license fee and say you are paying for these mistakes to Donald Trump. I mean, that is toxic for the BBC. I mean, that's why I think, unless they may have some form of insurance, and so there's no issue for license fee paying out for their mistakes.
Insure themselves from being sued by Donald Trump. I wonder if they have. That would show some quite foresight.
It's that kind of week, Rob.
I know it probably will happen by the end of Friday. We'll probably be in that world. I don't know. I mean, it just that would be, like you say, disastrous. It's just they write themselves those articles, don't they?
Yeah, they really do. And just finally, Rob Burley, do you feel that is journalism in some sort of trouble? People are chasing these clickbaits. This idea you talk about in your book about proper scrutiny, surely that's time that needs to be supported, particularly by a publicly funded broadcaster more.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's we used to have a very proud tradition in this country. I mean, which was that we had these. I remember Brian Walden once said. Brian Walden, who was a great interviewer in the '70s, said that we actually can hold our politicians to account on television because of the culture we've developed here better than they can really do in Parliament, and that was true. That's what he used to do, and it went on for a long period after he was there. But now, all we get 6-minute interviews on a round of interviews that politicians do, in which they try and say nothing of any consequence, repeat lines. We even have stories of ministers and staff, watching interviews back in Downing Street and cheering every time they get the slogan in, and seeing who can get the slogan in as many times as possible. I mean, it's just that is the level, and that whatever that interview kind of interviews are, they're not for the voter or the viewer or the listener. They're just a game, and it's too important for it to be just a game. But the BBC, I'm afraid, has walked away from this. They've just left the field. And so we've sort of given up on proper scrutiny. I mean, Laura Kuenssberg's show does have a lot of political interviews. They're not very long, and I understand why. But really, the BBC at least, because it's supposed to do things that the market can't quite support, the BBC at least should offer that service. But certainly Tim Davie just wasn't interested. I mean, his predecessor Tony Hall, after a very famous interview that Andrew Neil had done with Boris Johnson, rang him up and said, "We really should have you on the TV more," which was kind of ironic because he was having, at that point, we're giving him less. But then they then gave him a show to have long interviews, because Tony Hall, a journalist, by the way, from in terms of where he come from, realised the value of it again by seeing that interview, and that's what happened. So, and Tim Davie then axed it. So, I really would hope that whoever the DG is, the head of news is, that realises that these things are really important, and that we should be, the BBC should be, emphasising that democracy is a good thing to do.
Let's see how that plays out. Listen, Rob Burley, thank you for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast. And your book, please wave it again for me. And what's it called?
Where is it gone? It's called "Why Is This Lying Bastard Lying to Me?" And and also I now apparently I've paid the advance back. So if you buy it, I actually get money for it. So
look at
please do that.
That's a plea for your Christmas present fund from Rob Burley. Thank you for joining us today. Great to see you. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rob Burley, thank you for joining us on Chopper's Political Podcast. That's what's like inside the BBC, but what's the politics of this scandal involving our national broadcaster? Joining me now is Sir John Whittingdale. He's a former Conservative Culture Secretary, also sat on the Culture Committee, chaired it for a while. He's steeped in the politics of the BBC and the regulation around it. Sir John Whittingdale, thank you for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast. You are very experienced in the world of media, culture, regulation, policy, etc. Having been, of course, a culture secretary under the Conservatives, and then running, of course, a culture, media and sport select committee at various times. You've seen a few BBC crises. I've seen them. We've talked before about them elsewhere. How big is this one?
I do think this is a very big one. I mean, you're absolutely right. And I date back to when I was chairing the select committee, and we had Mark Thompson in to talk about Jonathan Ross and Russell Brand. And there have been a succession. I mean, they come around about once every 6 months, which is why being Director General is a horrendous job. And I do feel for Tim Davie.
Is it a possible job? Or should he be Editor-in-Chief as well as DG?
Well, that is something I think needs to be looked at, because, the BBC is a £4.5 billion organisation with 20,000 employees. Running it is a full-time job.
Yeah.
And to have to then take responsibility for the whole of editorial output seems to me to be almost too much for one man. But that's something that they can look at in
that's part of
the charter. But in terms of, the latest revelations, I think the reason this is so damaging is because it is news and current affairs, which is the absolute heart of the BBC, and it opens the whole of their output into doubt. So always before, people wanted to be able to turn to the BBC and rely upon what it said as being objective, impartial, and that trust has been damaged, no question.
Have you read the Michael Prescott dossier?
Yeah, I mean, I know Michael Prescott. I haven't read the whole thing.
Yes.
I-
He's not a Tory stooge, is he?
no, he's not at all.
If it's actually on page 2 of the dossier, he's got no views really on America, Gaza.
I mean,
it's cool.
I, of course, knew Michael when he was in the lobby as a Sunday Times political correspondent. He was very good. And, one or two of the more sort of hysterical commentators have said, oh, it was a Murdoch newspaper. It's a Murdoch newspaper. But, I think anybody who's ever worked for the Times or Sunday Times would say that, they remain completely independent. And Michael was an extremely good journalist.
Yes, it was ridiculous, isn't it, really? Do you think the BBC is biased? I mean, what's your experience? I mean,
Look, I mean,
you've been around for a long. I mean, you don't need the press dossier to tell you what you think of the BBC.
This has been a debate that's been going on for years. I've never thought that the BBC has a sort of inbuilt bias towards one party or another. They don't all sort of secretly plot to elect a Labour
against the Tories.
Yeah.
Maybe so.
But where I do think there is a concern, and has been for a long time, is that the BBC have a certain view of the world. They recruit sort of Guardian reading metropolitan liberal left, and their attitude affects all of the BBC's coverage, which means that they've made mistakes in the past. They sort of dismissed concerns about migration for a long time. They seemed to think, it was only sort of extremists who were worried about the level of migration. That was plainly wrong. They dismissed people who were going to vote for Brexit and thought that was, again, a sort of rather naive sort of extremist view. That was wrong. And in recent times, certainly the coverage of the Gaza conflict, the coverage of the debate around trans, and indeed a certain anti-Americanism and particularly anti-Trumpism has been very obvious.
Yes. Has the reaction been overblown, do you think? I mean, it has been quite.
I mean, I think the Prescott dossier contained a whole series of really quite concerning revelations. But I mean, I have to say, I think the Panorama one was extraordinary. And any journalist, I would imagine, would understand that the idea that you splice together two entirely separate quotes and create what the BBC themselves have said was an impression that he was calling for violence and direct action. I mean, that is outrageous.
The central allegation against him, which he fought, didn't he, in the States? The inaction by the board, to me, is surprising. They saw this document in January and May, according to reports, and nothing happened.
Well, in January and in May, it went to the editorial guidelines and standards committee. Now, on that committee sat the chair of the BBC, the Director General of the BBC, I think at the critical meeting, Deborah Turness, the head of news, and Jonathan Monroe, and there is also Robbie Gibb, who obviously has been in the news about his own.
Come to him shortly, yes.
But as I understand it, there was a debate, but essentially the editorial committee said, well, we're going to say to Panorama, but we think you got this a bit wrong. But that was it. And there was no public statement, there was no retraction. And it wasn't until it all broke, the Prescott dossier leaked, that suddenly, people started calling it out, and the Director General then resigned. In the statement that Lisa Nandy made to the House, I said that, not only did I regard the Panorama programme as the most serious flaw, and indeed even subsequently to just call it an error of judgment, I thought was it looked to most people like a deliberate distortion. It wasn't just some sort of minor mistake. But also the fact that they knew about it in May, and we're now in November, and nothing appeared to have happened in that meantime.
And it was in-house as well, Sir John. I've been told that although Octopus Films were making it, the edits were done in-house. It was a bit of a hybrid. It wasn't a fully outsourced documentary like the Gaza one, I think, in the past have been for the different broadcaster. It was in-house. It was a mist. There were
if the edit was done in-house, obviously that does make it very serious. But even if it wasn't, the BBC broadcast it. And, as we've said in previous occasions, like, for instance, the Hamas documentary, the broadcaster has the ultimate responsibility of ensuring that it meets the editorial standards.
So there was silence, wasn't there? And we now think it was a bit of a battle with the board level about how to respond. But to hear Tim Davie this week describe the critics of the corporation as enemies, I think is part of the problem here, surely.
I wouldn't...
surely that's right.
I wouldn't disagree with you. I would have hoped that Tim Davie would understand that this goes to the heart of the BBC's reputation, trust, and therefore it is desperately serious. And actually, the people who are most concerned about the impact of the BBC, of the Panorama programme aren't the BBC's enemies; they're the BBC's friends. They're the people who want the BBC to remain, the beacon of British broadcasting that it's been in the past.
I think everyone's there. People think, GB News will be against the BBC for various reasons, but that's not the case. I mean, we all like traitors. We love the David Attenborough's show. Yeah. We like the news when it's presented, even-handedly. But that, as you say, you've been going through the issues where it appears not to be.
Well, I mean, in terms of GB News, I mean, one of the most important things for the BBC is that there should be plurality. And, friends of the BBC will also say, but, the BBC can't be the only source of news. That in itself would be dangerous. So the fact that, we do have ITM, we do have Sky, and we do have GB News is a very important additional element.
Have the BBC's defenders helped here? People like Nick Robinson on the Today programme. David Yellen, the former Sun editor, now works at the BBC, doing a podcast called When It Hits the Fan, calling it a victory for populists, the collapse of Tim Davie, for a cabal of toxic plotters with links to the BBC board who designed and executed a coup. I mean, does that even help?
No, well, it plainly doesn't help, but I think it's also nonsense.
Yes.
I have a great deal of time for Tim Davie. I know him well, and I think he's
Conservative councillor.
He's a decent man, and he's been wrestling with what is now arguably an impossible job. And Tim has had to cope with the succession and sort of revelations and scandals that we talked about at the beginning, in the same way that every previous Director General has had to. And sooner or later, the sad truth is, the record of Director Generals who've had to resign is getting longer and longer.
But what a job, by the way. I mean, you're paid and you're running the BBC. I mean,
well, actually, you are well paid, but if you look at, for instance, Chief Executive of Channel 4, that paid over twice as much.
Oh, right. Okay. But you're still running the BBC.
Yeah. That in itself, I mean, the
third line of your obituary.
It is indeed. And the BBC have always said it's a great privilege to work for the BBC, and actually, therefore, we don't need to pay people as much.
Yes. And Pierre's paid $160,000 a year, which is a fraction of what the DDs pay. So, why did the BBC get into these scrapes? You think you mentioned every 6 months, or I think you're slightly exaggerating, but is it that the BBC has to have crises?
Well, if you look at
justify why it exists in the first place, and then if it didn't exist, what would happen then? Is that why?
I mean, it's not just. Well, first of all, I don't think 6 months is an exaggeration. If you take right across the board, so I mean, on the news front, we've had Glastonbury, we've had Hamas documentary, but alongside that, you've had Hugh Edwards, a completely different type of scandal, but also a MasterChef guy. I mean, they all, each one taken together sort of chips away a bit more at the reputation of the BBC. Now, the BBC would say, with some justice, they produce thousands of hours of content and things go wrong. Of course things go wrong. But what I think those of us who've been following the BBC for a long time are concerned about is that every time there is something like this, the BBC says, we'll have an internal inquiry. We put in place measures to make sure this sort of thing doesn't happen again.
After the problem.
But it does happen again. And, it goes on happening again.
Yes. How can it restore trust? I mean, you mentioned Robbie Gibb earlier, Sir Robbie Gibb, of course, Director of Comms number 10 under Theresa May. He's on the board. I mean, appointed by Boris Johnson.
Well, Chris, it's just worth saying, in the same way, Michael Pesca had a distinguished record as a Westminster correspondent for the Sunday Times. I knew Robbie Gibb when he was the head of BBC Westminster. He was the editor of Daily Politics. He
gave you a hard time.
And he did. And he deputy editor of Newsnight. And so he actually is steeped in news on the BBC. And nobody ever questioned his impartiality.
But Robbie Gibb is there in the front pages. The people saying he should go. I mean, asked in PMQs. I think Ed Davey may have mentioned it, the Lib Dem leader in PMQs on Wednesday. I mean, why does your government appoint people to the board of the BBC? I guess it's because the BBC has to reflect the electorate and how it's thinking. Is that right? So therefore, the winning the election gets to appoint people to the board of the BBC. Is that the reason why it happens?
I've never seen a problem with people who have had a political background sitting on the board. And if you go back, Joel Barnett was deputy chairman. He was a Labour cabinet minister. Chris Patten, of course, was chair, having a Conservative cabinet minister.
It's always happened, isn't it?
It has. When I objected was actually when it wasn't a board appointment, it was a management appointment.
Right.
Those have to be kept independent. And of course, the most sort of glaring example was James Burnell. There was a Labour cabinet minister who was made director of strategy of the BBC, a management
Who's being talked
job.
about again as a need.
Well, he could not possibly do it because, it is important that the very senior management of the BBC, not board members, but the senior management are seen to be completely
Tim
impartial.
Daly's background was with marketing, I think, Pepsi.
Yes,
And then, so he was a bit business person, but also he did stuff for a
And
little
or him, Tony Hall,
Tony
or him, Mark Thompson. I was George Entwistle for a rather short time.
short period of time. But yes. But so Robbie Gibb shouldn't be fired. He's doing his job there of maybe trying to balance a debate up at a senior level within the BBC.
The one thing, people who know Robbie, the one thing that Robbie cares about more than any other issue is impartiality. He always has done. And therefore, I think he was worried by the Prescott report because it cast into doubt the BBC's impartiality.
And David Grossman worked for him. And I guess that's why people are saying it's a right-wing plot, because it was those three who produced the dossier which brought down a DG.
But the dossier contained some really serious revelations. It's no good blaming the people for the dossier when the dossier itself was actually really worrying.
Well, the dossier, not everything else. That's how you resolve this issue. Quickly, we're talking Thursday morning, 5 p.m. US time, 10 p.m. UK time, Friday. Donald Trump has given the BBC a choice. Does it say sorry and offer some damages for this this wrongly edited Panorama? What should the BBC do?
Well, the BBC should certainly apologise. They should apologise to Donald Trump, even if he hadn't sued them for $1 billion. They did do him a grave injustice, and he is entitled to have that apology.
Yes.
Now, the $1 billion lawsuit, we know Trump. He loves a sort of headline.
Yes.
And he's a businessman. And I think if the BBC said, look, we absolutely got this wrong. We really do apologise. But you've got to understand that this is not our money. It's paid for by the British taxpayer. There are real problems. And if the British government, I think, sort of made it clear that they were very sympathetic to the request that Donald Trump should accept the apology, then hopefully
they might move on, because it'd be hard to sell if we ought to pay £1 a Trump tax on our licence fee, which it could be that took a fiver each to pay for their mistakes.
Yeah,
that would be a complete disaster.
Well, the licence fee,
that's insured. It might be insured again.
Well, the licence fee is already, becoming more and more unpopular as it goes up each year, and people feel less and less that they need to watch the BBC. I think this would just add to the feeling of injustice about being forced to pay a licence fee.
So the BBC should apologise, but not pay any money to Donald Trump.
Well, they should talk to Donald Trump and see if, he will accept the apology.
Just finally, on the BBC, is it under existential threat? I've heard that said today by broadcasters on the corporation's channels. Existential threat?
No. I think the need for the BBC is stronger than ever, because not just as a domestic public service broadcaster, but its international reputation. In a world where we're confronted by Russian disinformation, Chinese propaganda, the internet full of sort of wild, unmonitored speculation, we need places to go that we can trust. And the BBC has always been one of those.
And GB News now.
And indeed, GB News adds to, the choice, which is terribly important. But, I do think there's a question separately over the sustainability of the licence. That is a completely different issue.
That's not for grabs in the current charter review, is it?
Well, it could be. The charter will cover the funding of the BBC, and the government has set up a panel to consider it. But the trouble is, at the moment, it's very difficult to see alternatives.
Yes, and I might link it to income. I think that was an idea. We should just sharp Peter's jabbing, but
you've got. People say, why can't you have a subscription like Netflix or Amazon? Well, the simple answer is because lots of people don't have the ability to watch stream services. They're still on, traditional terrestrial broadcasting. And until that changes, it's very hard to move to subscription. The alternative is advertising. But if you do that, then channels like GB News or indeed ITV that depend on advertising will be really clobbered. So I don't think that is the answer either.
Will it exist in 10 years' time? The BBC will exist in 10 years' time, surely.
Yes, I think it will.
Will the licence fee be here in 10 years' time?
I think whether or not it's still being paid in 10 years' time, I think the end will be in sight. As I say, I think we have to wait till terrestrial transmission ceases, but that is likely to happen within 10 years. And at that time, alternatives become available.
Look, Sir John Whittingdale, thank you for joining us for a quick scamper through another chaotic week at our national broadcaster, the BBC. Thank you for joining us.
Chris, many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, John Whittingdale, for joining us on Chopper Political Podcast. Thank you earlier to Rob Burley and to Graham Stringer, the Labour MP. I hope you enjoyed this show. I certainly have. I tweet at Christopher Hope on X. Email me, chopper@gbnews.uk. Tell me what you think of the show. How can we improve it? Any thoughts, and we'll try and reflect them next week. If you enjoyed this show, please do tell your friends. If you really enjoyed it, leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you hear it, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, elsewhere. That helps other people to find it and join in the fun. Thanks to the great team of colleagues behind the podcast at GB News. Mick Booker and Jeff Marsh are the guiding minds, but the key people running the show, the worker bees gathering all the pollen and the honey, are the worker bees. That, of course, is Rebecca Nunes, the queen bee herself, and that important and hard-working drone, George Macmillan. And most importantly of all, thank you again for listening. If you want more Chopper in your life, and they do, I know they do, really, I think they do anyway, do catch me during the week on GB News with my latest political updates. I present sometimes and do my best for all of our viewers at GB News. And of course, catch up with the best reporting on gbnews.com. But until next time, cheerio!